Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Public Library. And I have my colleague, Lucy Norval. She is the Manager of Programming and Development and helps put all of our programs together. So she's on with me as well. Before I introduce our special guest this evening, I would like to read this land acknowledgement that was approved by the library's Board of Trustees on May 20th of this year. The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Owaskawag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. Thank you. Our Bicentennial Series was made possible through the financial partnership of the Scarborough Public Library and the Scarborough Historical Society, and through a grant awarded by the Maine Humanities Council in the fall of 2019. Our first program was held pre-pandemic on March 1st, 2020. Dr. Liam Riordan, Professor of History at the University of Maine, delivered his talk, Past and Present Perspectives in Maine Statehood. The recording of that program can be found on the library's Bicentennial page. As part of the Bicentennial Series, a quilt was created from quilt squares sewn by over 40 local quilters and featuring scenes from Scarborough and Scarborough history. We recently displayed this beautiful quilt on Governor William King's bed in the center of the library, and now the squares can be seen on our website, also on the Bicentennial page. So once again, welcome to our encore presentation of Mapping Maine, the Land and Its Peoples, 1677 to 1842, presented by Dr. Matthew Edney. Dr. Edney curated the Osher Map Library's Maine Bicentennial exhibition. Tonight's presentation will feature images from that, as well as some specific to the Scarborough area. A native of London, England, Dr. Matthew Edney moved to the US in 1983 and received a master's degree in cartography and a PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been a professor of geography at the University of Southern Maine since 2007 and is the Osher Professor in the History of Cartography, responsible for teaching map history. He is also faculty scholar in the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education. Since 2005, he has also directed the History of Cartography project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So thank you very much, Dr. Edney, for coming back to do your presentation once again for us here in Scarborough.
Thank you. So let me just share my screen and do it right this time. Yes. So you should all see big title with a green leaf 1820 map on the left. So thank you, Lucy Norvell and Catherine Morrison and everyone else at Scarborough. And thank you for asking me back for a repeat. It's always nice to know that your work is appreciated. So yay. Just a quick blurb. The Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education is housed on the Portland campus of University of Southern Maine. It has wonderful early globe collection, about 500,000 items. It's hard to count when you get up to that kind of number. We have a world-class equipped digital studio, and that's driving a lot of our website, which is just oshermaps.org. OSHER maps.org, which is about to get a major revamp, in which I have nothing to do. I set up the website to begin with years ago, but anyway. And we have an exhibit space, and we do exhibits. Even during COVID lockdown, we were still open to appointment to exhibits. Go on the website, you can find out more and what we're doing, what's going to come up, and so on. So please check us out and learn more. As Catherine mentioned, I direct the History of Cartography project at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. My first 2 years as a grad student were working as the illustrations editor of Volume 1. The Volume 4, which I co-edited with Mary Pedley, came out in 2019. And we just have 1 volume left, Volume 5 in the 19th century. So hopefully in just a few years' time, we will be done. And then I shall retire. One of the things I've done was to persuade the University of Chicago Press, our publisher, to put the volumes online for free public access, which began 1 and 2 in July 2011. In the last 10 years, we have had a total of about just under like 10,000, under 4 million hits on the pages, accessing them, reading them, downloading them. Free access, more map history goodness than you can imagine. Now, I should also say that this, of course, takes money. So if anybody would like to give the History of Cartography project any money, please contact me and I'll be happy to talk you through the various options. So I curated the Bicentennial Show for the map library. Although like most events and installations associated with the Bicentennial, it was delayed and postponed by the pandemic. It was finally installed in September 2020, and here's the great Kevin doing part of that installation. And it came down in March, but it is available online at the website. You just go to oshermaps.org, under Explore, choose Gallery Exhibits, and it will pop right up. You'll see all the labels, and you'll be able to zoom in on all the maps to your heart's content. I must thank Libby Bischoff, Executive Director of the Osher Map Library, for all of her help. James E. Francis Sr., Penobscot Tribal Historian, for his advice and for contributing some reflections on a couple of maps. David Nykirk and Adina Barnett did the imaging of the items. Hope Mowry did the website, and Kevin Kimball, as here, Kimball Street Studios, did the installation. The cause, the event for the exhibit was, of course, Maine's statehood, the bicentennial Maine statehood, on the 15th of March, 1820. And just to explain, any item that is in the map library will have the URLs displayed down below. And also anything with a bold number is an item that's in the show and is online in the online version. Now, there's a lot of items in the show. There's a lot going on. And here in 30, 40 minutes, I can only really address one thread. So I really highly recommend go look at it online for all the rest of the information. But how should we treat the bicentennial? We've learned the lessons of the Columbus quincentennial in 1992. The European exploration and settlement of the Americas came at a profound cost to the native peoples and environments. In the map library's case, this exhibit can't simply laud geography, exploration, science, empire, and English settlement in the way that exhibits used to do. We cannot show off great maps without also thinking about maps as images of power and tools of empire, and actively working to reclaim other kinds of maps and other conceptions of space. The building that housed the exhibition occupies land whose reclamation from the sea in the 19th century destroyed the inshore waters that had once helped sustain the Wabanaki peoples of Aquasisco. We cannot celebrate Maine's 200th birthday without also commemorating the displacement of the Wabanaki peoples, the people of the Dawnland, heirs to a continual inhabitation of the land that would become Maine for at least 12 to 13,000 years. And here I just want to stress that the Wabanaki made maps. Most Wabanaki mapping was oral in nature. When inscribed, it was often in less than durable forms. This is called a wikhikon. It's a map engraved or etched, I should say, on birch bark. These are very friable, very delicate. Glyphs engraved on rocks are eroded and covered by later carvings. And all of these, even their inscriptive works, like the wikhikonol, the stone rocks, are still embedded in oral practice and performance. And as such, these are very much not the kind of maps that the map library has been able to collect. What we've collected through donation and through some acquisition, and I should stress not using taxpayer money for that, other sort of the printed maps, the maps that are commonly found in the trade that the collectors have bought from and then given to us so that we can buy from directly. But through those maps, the kind of maps that will dominate in this presentation, we can trace multiple paths through those maps, maps made by Europeans and Americans, to construct a more sensitive spatial history of Maine. So in the actual exhibition, I sought to trace some of the wider spatial patterns of Wabanaki and Maine history over the last 4 centuries by using map library collections to show the displacement and the persistence, I really must stress persistence, of the Wabanaki, and in particular the Penobscot. We have a few items from the Passamaquoddy in our materials, but it's the Penobscot that are really well, the history of the Penobscot is very well represented in our collections. For example, I used the maps of Osgood Carleton and Moses Greenleaf to trace how the Penobscot were progressively denied of their lands by colonial and then state authorities. On the right of your screen, you see a detail of Hancock County from this early manuscript by Carleton from 1795. And running up the Penobscot River, you have the phrase Penobscot Indian land, and it's already being restricted by the revolution, by Massachusetts, by after revolution. So here are the words, and I should note that the name for the river is written differently. So this actually refers to the people, this reference to Penobscot. And they're already being encroached on in these areas. By 1820, the Penobscot were limited to just the islands in the river itself and a few towns to the north, all of which would be lost soon enough. But today I can't go through the entire exhibit and its 38 items. So just 2 themes. First, I'm going to use a map to show the early process of colonization and to explain why Maine was ever part of Massachusetts to begin with. And then to have some thoughts, give some thoughts on the differences between indigenous and Western mapping practices, at least in terms of property mapping. The Wabanaki are clearly present in the first maps made by Europeans. In the detailed maps of the resource-rich estuaries of the Kennebec and Saco rivers by Samuel de Champlain from 1605, published in 1613, we can see a detail of the mouth of the Saco River. Further south in Maine, firmly within the region of corn cultivation, you can see all the cornfields, and the area of year-round native settlements that had formed at least 1,000 years ago. On the left, the Kennebec River marks the traditional limit of corn cultivation. You don't see those big cornfields on this map. From here eastward to the Gaspé was a region of primarily migratory hunter-gatherers. There were some permanent settlements on the coast, but very, very few compared to Kennebec, west and south. Now, here is what's called the Bulkley Stoughton Map, for reasons I don't have time to get into. And it's great because it shows so many different things. Is it a manuscript map? Manuscript means handmade. Most of the early 17th century maps made by the English in New England were manuscript. And this is one of the few official maps, a map actually made at the orders of the Massachusetts Bay authorities to show, in this particular case, the territorial limits. It's part of what's called the Blaithwaite Atlas that is in the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. And I must thank Brown, its librarians and curators, for letting us borrow this map for the show. This is undoubtedly the most important map in the whole show. And just to give you a sense of locations, you can see this is a map running from Connecticut River to Cape Cod up to the Kennebec and across the Lake Winnipesaukee. Maine then in the 1670s, is actual, the original map was made about 1676. This particular copy was drawn in London in 1683 from one that was sent over from Massachusetts. It was copied on the orders of William Blaithwaite, who was a really major bureaucrat in the English government at the time. So as I say, there are so many important things about this map. First of all, if you look closely, you can see that it shows a very few what can be called nucleated settlements or urban places. They're too small to be called cities, and you can't call them towns because that means something else. So Salem, Boston, Charlestown, Cambridge are drawn here on this map as a complex, as a dense array of houses, suggesting complex, confined, nucleated settlement. These are uniformly associated with some kind of sea or riverport in the case of Cambridge. The rest of the map show the dispersed settlement of agricultural towns, the area of territory less than a county are known as towns, such as Andover, Reading, and Concord. And here the houses are sort of shown scattered around a bit, suggestive of the fact that population, the English colonial population, was very dispersed in rural areas. The modern idea of the modern nucleated New England village with the green and the meeting house and so on, and the clustering of housing around it, that's actually a function of industrialization of New England in the early 19th century. The colonial period, most English settlement was very dispersed, and you can see that contrast very nicely in this map. Another thing is there are elements of the map that suggest a reliance on indigenous information. The enlarged Lake Winnipesaukee filled in with many islands and the bulbous larynx, definite thyroid problem on the upper Merrimack. These are very reminiscent in style of how Europeans interpreted indigenous information communicated in a performative process. The idea is that, and we can see this historically actually in the work of the Cree, Osher, who gave information to French fur traders, in particular a man called de la Vendrier. And so Osher actually wrote on in sand or on paper and narrated what he was drawing as he drew it. And the French are busily copying this as he drew it and making notes as he spoke. But of course, there's a question of translation. Osher might have been speaking French, the French might have been speaking Cree, but not necessarily perfectly so. And then there's a question of speed and understanding. And so what to Osher are important points become circles, which might be settlements, they might be ponds, they might be beaver sites, whatever. But to the English, they all get drawn, mimicked in the French writing as a series of small lakes. And then the proliferation of islands in the lakes, I still haven't had properly explained to me, but the indication here of Lake Winnipesaukee is very large arenas, definitely has connotations of information sourced from indigenous sources. Now, the reason for this map was that it was specifically commissioned by Massachusetts Bay authorities to explain to Charles II in London why Massachusetts Bay claimed the territories that it did. So it's a wonderful map for explaining, as a basis for explaining why Massachusetts Bay ended up with much larger territory than initially imagined. And I should just note up the center of the map, just to the left of Lake Winnipesaukee, there's a very nice, precisely, very strictly drawn scale of latitude that really quite contrasts in its precision with the relatively crude line work of the rivers and the coastlines. Now, in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Charter specified that the territory was to extend to 3 miles north and 3 miles south of the Merrimack and Charles rivers, because when it was granted, everybody in England, in London, assumed that the Merrimack and the Charles rivers flowed in a west to east direction, not realizing that the rivers actually turn to the north and to the south quite significantly. After some colonists headed inland in 1635 to the Connecticut River, questions arose if they fell within the legitimate bounds and authority of Massachusetts Bay, or were they outside Massachusetts Bay's jurisdiction, which the migrants all desperately hoped. So Massachusetts sent 2 surveyors, Nathaniel Woodward and Solomon Saffery, to travel to the head of the Charles River in 1641, observe the latitude of the source of the river, make a small adjustment for 3 miles south of that point, and then they took the overland Pequot Trail across to the Connecticut River and tried to figure out where exactly that parallel of latitude lay vis-a-vis the new settlements on the Connecticut River. And they found that the parallel fell just to the north of the breakaway colonists, who therefore remained outside Massachusetts jurisdiction. Subsequently, in 1649, England enters what's they call the head of Charles I, and you have the period known as the Interregnum. All the pre-Civil War royal charters, like that made to Sir Ferdinando Gorge, who was the big patent holder of what is now Maine, they were all suspended. And that allowed Massachusetts to start annexing timberlands, very valuable timberlands in what is now New Hampshire and southern Maine. And they justified this annexation to Charles II by a new interpretation of the border. And what they had done in 1652, they had sent John Sherman and Jonathan Ince to the head of the Merrimack, where they observed the latitude. They added 3 miles to equivalent. And then the following year, they sent 2 mariners, Andrew and Clark, to figure out where on the coast that parallel cuts, and they found that it cuts the coast in Casco Bay, not too far from Bolton Head, and again over near the Kennebec. And it's based on that Massachusetts Bay could claim that what is now the very southernmost tip of Maine, and by sort of extension everywhere else up the coast, were in fact legitimately part of Massachusetts Bay. But at the same time, in this period, you have beginnings of a long phase of territorial aggression between the English and indigenous peoples. King Philip's War, in particular, 1675-76, took place in southern England, was a vicious war, and that only heralded a whole series of conflicts that lasted in northern New England right up until 1715, 1720. Those wars, at least certainly the King Philip's War, was commemorated by William Hubbard, Puritan minister from Ipswich, who adorned his account of King Philip's War with this map. And you can see from the shape of Cape Cod, the nature of Lake Winnipesaukee and the width of Narragansett Bay and so on, that this is actually derived from the same source as the Bulkley Stoughton map was. Here's a map, here's the same map in proper orientation, and you'll see that there are a number of numbers scattered around the map as well as place names. Here's a bit more of a detail showing where we are. You can see Casco Bay at number 40, Kennebec River 48, and so on. 55, these numbers point to a summary table of events, mostly atrocities committed by the Indians against the English, omitting all the atrocities committed by the English against various Indian groups, almost entirely. And you can see, for example, number 55, Falmouth, on the hither side of Casco Bay, where August 11, about 34 persons were killed and taken by the Indians, pages 32, 33, 34. Those last cross-references point back to the main narrative by Hubbard of the events of the war. So you could look on the map, see, oh, 55, oh, what's that? Go to the summary table where the map was actually bound in the original book, find 55, and then you say, oh, that's interesting. You can then go to the fuller narrative for more information. This is, and then just pulling out a bit from that last detail, you can see just above Casco Bay above it, there's some woods, and from the woods you've got two native figures with what look like rifles over their shoulders coming out, very indicative of the ongoing conflict between the English and Native Americans in northern New England that would basically push all the settlement in Maine, the early settlement, all the way back to Massachusetts. Eventually, the English get back. They essentially wear the Wabanaki down by attrition. So the Wabanaki are no longer able by 1710, 1720 to prevent English encroachments again, and they essentially are fighting a rearguard action to try to preserve as much as they can. Why do the English really want to go back? Well, the answer is very much encapsulated in this glorious title cartouche to Oscar Carleton's 1802 printed map of Maine, where you can see several things. You have that explain the Anglo-American quest for land, timber for shipbuilding and other construction in the foreground, and in the back you can see a pretty pastoral scene of farming, land for farming and for growing families and so on. These are the twin drivers of English settlement and Anglo-American settlement back up into Maine after 1720. 1716, Massachusetts Bay formally reopened settlement in Maine, and they start to lay out towns in the land in Maine in a series of towns, either given to individuals in lieu of cash because they were owed money from serving in various wars, or they were actually sold off. Eventually, by 1760, they begin to be administratively set off from each other. So the Eastern District of Massachusetts, which was the County of York, gets divided up into Cumberland County, York County, Lincoln County. Each county centered on a particular estuary, the Saco, Sebago, Kennebec, and or the Penobscot further east, which is still not really well settled in 1761. This map was made by John Small, who was from Scarborough. He laid out the major divisions of Scarborough in 1751, for example. It's actually a rather tragic story. He spent a lot of time in the militias, which he acquired a big fuzzy bear skin hat that he loved wearing, kept him very warm. He was on an expedition to map the route up the Kennebec to go across to Quebec when the commander of the expedition, out hunting for food, mistook him for a bear and shot him by mistake. And that was the end of the most promising mapmaker of Maine in the 18th century, to quote the then governor. On this map, which is from that governor's papers, ultimately, you can see very clearly Scarborough and Falmouth towns. There are these isolated church-like icons which represent the meeting houses that are the sort of focal points of otherwise dispersed settlement. And there on the Mashegon Peninsula, you have that cluster of an urban place based on the Fall River. The urban place, the village of Falmouth, that eventually will become called Portland. And so we have a nice hierarchy of territorialization. We have the district, we have counties, and the counties are then divided up into towns. And of course, the towns over time will be repeatedly subdivided. So Falmouth in 1786 splits off Portland, which now becomes Portland. Same year it sets off Cape Elizabeth and later set off Westbrook, and so on. So the modern Falmouth is just sort of the rump of all the other set-offs over the course of the 18th, 19th century. In the interior of the small map, we can still see Wabanaki villages. In practice, there are many other people existing in the gaps between English settlement. Wabanaki, of course, French in the far north, Irish immigrants, and so on. But in the further inland, you do have this notice of persistent Wabanaki settlement. In both cases, just upstream from major falls. Falls are a really good point of access to resources. They're very good for fishing in particular, and also very good for moving up and down the riverbed. So anyway, eventually these towns, Old Norwich in particular, are going to disappear from the tidy territorial hierarchy as that expands across what had been Wabanaki lands as they're progressively acquired by the English and then the Anglo-Americans. Now, to be clear, Native Americans did not make these kinds of maps of landscape divided into properties. But this is not because they had no concept of landed property. In fact, detailed studies by Margaret Pierce have shown that indigenous peoples in New England followed the same traditional practices of defining property, laying out property, referring to property, as in fact the English did, these English colonists who came across. They both held land in common. This is a very big issue in Scarborough, where the marshes were initially held in common among a number of people. They both referred to land by estimations of distances from here up the river to some point for such a long time, such a long distance. They both mark key boundary points, either blazing, shaping trees that exist, or inserting markers, stakes, piles of stone, or what have you. And both undertook periodic communal acts of beating the bounds, of going around the markers that show their properties, communal, personal, varied, and making quite sure all the markers are in the right place, they haven't been defaced, haven't been moved, and so on. It's just that by the time the English were settling in Maine, their practices of property, of maintaining and regulating property, were already well integrated with practices of law and commerce. And those practices used inscription to record boundaries, including graphic inscription. Now, I distinguish between a metes and bounds description, right, which is a verbal description. This property is bounded on, bound starting at a point, and you go along the road for a certain distance and up a path, and eventually the verbal description, if you follow it in the landscape, will close in on itself. In addition to verbal descriptions, they also use graphic inscriptions, like this image, which is one of innumerable plans of property, generally found in family archives, which are now often in historical societies, sometimes in local, and very rarely in state archives. And similarly, it's not enough to look at a Wick-Hecon like this one by Chief Septimer of a moose hunt and judge it by its incomplete depiction of features. This map was meant to accompany an oral performance. And the Smithsonian Institution, which now houses this item, which was acquired by a man called Garrick Mallory only in 1879, 80 years after it had been made. We have no idea how it came into the collections, and by the time it did, any kind of reference to that performance, what was said by Chief Septimer, that's long since gone. We just don't have it. This is sort of it's like reading a script for a TV show or for a film, and it's just a very blank verbal instructions with some scene setting. It has nothing to do with the full panoply of the incredible film or TV show that you're watching. Just a very partial record. And in fact, in that kind of sense, Chief Septimer's Wick-Hecon is not really that different from the kind of map you would get instructing you how to get to a party. This is from my wife's grad school times. If you go down Grand River Avenue, if you know anything about East Lansing, Grand River Ave is the big main thoroughfare through right past the Michigan State University. Park Lake is quite a dominant road, and it's very easy to get where you're going. But to understand both of these kinds of maps, you have to have a degree of communal awareness, an idea of understanding of how to begin the map, how the nature of the activities that you have to follow in using the map. And in fact, this is a matter for all maps in interpreting and reading and understanding any map, modern, old, Western, non-Western. The way that the map shows spatial relationships, what it includes, what it doesn't include, whether it uses graphic, gestural, oral strategies, whether you use landscape marks or whatever, they all reflect the intended function of the map and the fit of the map to the audience. What is the audience going to expect? It's sort of a language kind of issue. So in the case of English maps and then Anglo-American maps of property, they all follow some very basic qualities. They're really emphasizing two things: edges of properties and areas calculated of each fieldage, ownership, whatever. Except this map happens to have an extra thick green line that represents the banks of the Nonsuch River. So maybe this helps us locate the map in modern Google. I can't swear to this. This is my best guess. So that the diagonal of Nonsuch is roughly where Highland Avenue would be, and the lower left line is roughly Black Point Road, shall we say. That's my guess. I can't swear to it. But this is of interest because it points to a very particular and unique aspect of plans of Scarborough. In Scarborough, property disputes were often related to the nature of the landscape and to the division between marshland and what was commonly called upland in the 18th century. And so the property plans often include environmental information about the landscape, which generally you don't find in colonial early American property maps, which are just boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. Maybe trees, whether it would be marked as a boundary point. So here's a plan that's made as part of a massively complicated boundary dispute over what are called pitches, the plots of land taken by proprietors in 1720. And you can see a bit more if you just look at this detail. And I'm sorry, the background noise from my neighbors is getting in the way here. So here's that detail. I've changed the color a bit so you can see the details a bit more clearly. It has a statement of what's in dispute. This marsh in controversy, 12 acres and 10 square rods. Two different people, maybe three, are laying claim to this marsh between the river and the upland. And we know that edge of upland because we have this green line, thick green line that's being used to demarcate and symbolize the boundary of marsh with upland. And at the very top, you've got salt marsh. Just to reiterate that the area between the green lines is indeed salt marsh. This also has these great little house images, which are really quite cool, but that's another story. Going further, this, to my mind, is the third most important map in the exhibit. The most important was that 1683 manuscript map in New England. And the second most is the work that I will end the presentation with. This map is scrappy, and it shows the town that would briefly be known as Orneville, Township 1, Range 6, north of the Waldo Patent, NWP. Took me some time to figure out where it was, actually. Here's a detail, and you can see that the surveyor, as he's run certain lines, has recorded qualities of numbers of land features. And you can see he's explained them in the cartoon, in the legend at the right. So anything on the map in that detail, there's a 4 and a 5, a bunch of 6s, 4s, some 1s at the far left. They relate to this legend. So where 1 is a hardwood of first quality and 6 is black woods of some sort, black oaks, third degree of quality, less good for timber. Other indications are rocky areas, bogs, swamps, cedar pine, swamp cedar, pine, meadow, and so on. And so this gives you a sense of the nature of the resources in this town. And it allows the landowner a mechanism to assess the value of land, to price its sale, to price its rent, or just to price the value, price the value of the timber on it. In all of these mapping processes, usurping and acquiring Wabanaki lands, turning Maine into a neat territorial hierarchy of counties and towns, assessing the commercial value of the land and dividing it up for rent or sale, the Wabanaki were mapped out. They did not themselves, however, disappear. In the 19th century, they worked in seasonal trades, lumbering, potato harvesting, blueberry picking, art and craft sales to tourists from Bar Harbor to Mount Kineo to Poland Spring. They grew more integrated within the Maine economy in the 20th century, but still remain marginalized. As I mentioned at the beginning, oral traditions persist, but they're very hard to see. Which is why I emphasize in the exhibition the remarkable survival of an oral map. Consolidated, yes, this is a bunch of orally transmitted information that's being presented in a coherent way for a white readership, but nonetheless indicative of long-standing practices of experiential learning and oral transmission. It was provided by the Penobscot elder, Joseph Nicola, writing under the pseudonym of Young Sabatis, in a column for a weekly newspaper in about 1887. This is when the Old Town Herald, one of those newspapers that flourished for a short while and then disappeared, and you can't find copies of it at all. They're just all gone. We know it was printed. It's very hard to actually read it in terms of survival. To emphasize the difficulty of oral transmission and preserving oral transmission, the great historian Fanny Hardy Ekstrom rescued this map as a cutting of this particular column, quote, in a scrapbook found in rubbish abandoned in an old house. Like a good Mainer, she was out rummaging and picking. Here's the whole piece laid out for display. Much of it is an explanation of place names in the context of Penobscot life, starting on the west side of Penobscot Bay, working northwards, recording the names of places and their cultural context and resources. The west side is far more important because it's easier to travel upstream on the west side than it is on the east side of the river. East side is a lot more difficult on the shoreline. But for me, the crux of this text is not the individual place names, but Nicola's account of the communal message board at Fort Point on the western shore of Penobscot Bay. And to me, is redolent of the practices of long distance communication, just like the birch bark Wicoconor, by which bands and groups stayed in contact with the larger community. So as Nicola writes, now we come to the celebrated stepping ashore, now known as Old Fort Point, where hundreds of pleasure seekers during the summer months enjoy the cool sea breeze. But in the olden times, when a member of the tribe visited here, they only stopped long enough to make the sign of their visit, showing which direction they were going, the number of their party canoes, etc. The sign of their visit, that is to say, they made a mark, whether it was painted on the rock, whether it was engraved in the rock, a symbol for their particular tribe, their particular family. As he goes on to say, at the bottom of this statement, all the families of that tribe were known by a mark. Some were represented by animals, fish, and reptiles, others by well-known implements, or the moon, or the sun, and so on. So you have the marker for the family name, an indication of the number, the size of the party, and the direction in which they're moving. And so anyone can come and look at this and get a sense of where their friends are, where are everybody, where are they gone right now, where are they hunting, where are they fishing, where are they gathering, when are they going to be coming back. This is a wonderful instance. The persistence of the Penobscot, and for that matter, the other Wabanaki, recently manifested in a map of Maine by the Penobscot Nation. On one side is English, the English place names, or at least translations of the English place names. And the other side is in Penobscot, showing the Penobscot names. And this is the result of a long project by which the Penobscot Nation has tried to excavate numerous sources, have interviewed elders for their knowledge and so on. And it's just a work in progress. There will be future editions with updated information, expanded information, trying to reassess and recreate the nature of the Penobscot relationship to the land that we now call Maine. So again, all of this is in the show. You can see it online. Here's the opening page of the online. Please go look at it and let me know if you have any questions. And in fact, we're going to have questions now. Thank you.
So we have a question from Wayne. He says, can you explain the rectangular land subdivisions shown in Cumberland County on the 1761 map?
Why is it rectangular? By the mid-18th century, the British, the English are very parsimonious in their work. And so they tend to start using straight lines when they can, rather than trying to follow rivers or ridges or what have you. It makes the task of calculating areas and allocating areas of set sizes much, much easier. So yeah, straight lines, key mark of colonization. I don't know if at all of that is what you're after, but yeah, so looking at this again, the rectangular land subdivisions, those then are the towns. So the English in New England laid out towns, primarily laid out land in large towns, at least 6 miles by 6 miles in size, normally larger, and then let the town community figure out how to subdivide more remotely. Is a somewhat different process to what was followed in New York or further south, but it's the quote is the townships. Well, I call townships elsewhere in the United States, but towns in New England. Yeah, so the townships, rectangles are townships, towns. Oh, hi, Wayne. Yes.
Anyone else out there have any questions about the presentation? Or
Completely turned you all off.
I know we had someone out there who's been reading a book about map making and map collectors. I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, oh, two of my favorite topics.
Yeah. Maybe just while people think of some additional questions, if I don't know if you want to share just a little bit about how the Osher Map Library acquires its materials, or was it just one collection, donated by the?
Well, our main title reflects the two founding gifts. We are the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education. Sam and Eleanor Smith were a Philadelphia couple. They summited up the coast at Wolf Neck in Freeport. So if you've been to Wolf Neck State Park and walked in the trees there, they gave that to the state. Even in Freeport Historical Society, they gave that building to the Historical Society right on Main Street in center of Freeport. And they gave their map collection to the University of Southern Maine. And that prompted Harold and Peggy Osher to think about giving their map collection as well. The similar but quite different in actual details. And Harold and Peggy also worked with the then University administration in the 90s, early 90s, to raise money to help build the facility. So the two gifts, they're the two primary gifts. Since then, we've received multiple gifts. Retired professor of geography from Mount Holyoke, who retired to Maine, gave us his collection of maps of Spain. because he did his dissertation work in Spain. And when he was collecting, he was told collect something and choose one thing. So he chose maps of Spain. Also because they're cheaper than maps of Britain and France, fewer people interested. So since then, we've mostly relied upon the largesse of the Oshers. But we're in the process now. We have a new arrangement. Howard has given, the Osher family has given a large amount of money to the university. And so we'll have a quite large endowment fund specifically for further acquisitions as we go forward. But hey, if you've got an interesting map and is in good shape, we'll take it.
And our library director mentioned the book she's reading is The Map Thief.
Map Thief,
I'm
yes.
sure you've probably read before.
Yes.
So we do have another question or a comment from, looks like Molly Joe. I have always
Yes.
loved maps since I was a child. My family gave me the Historical Atlas of Maine for Christmas last year, and I believe it is an Osher publication.
The Historical Atlas of Maine, if you don't know it, you must go out and get it. Stephen Hornsby is the chief editor. It's actually published by the University of Maine Press. We collaborated with Stephen a lot and the Map Library in its production. And we hosted one part of the launch. But it's a map library adjacent publication, shall we say, but it is absolutely wonderful. One of the best books, certainly in Maine history and in geographical history in many, many years. I highly recommend it. Most of the map design was done by a man called Mike Herman, who's just brilliant at what he does. So yeah, it's a brilliant book.
And we do have that one in the library collection if anyone wants to borrow it, along with the Nicolar book as well. We have that here. So Mary says, fascinating how the shape of Maine on one of the maps was very good considering there were no aerial views. Ah,
yes. This is something always crops up. How did people make maps before aerial views? And that itself only really starts to happen in early 19th century with balloons. The way in which early maps were made was basically, well, it depended on the kind of map and who it was for and so on, but it's all grounded in making measurements on the Earth's surface. And if you do that long enough, then you can end up getting quite precise and, by modern standards, very accurate maps. I do just have to say that the aerial view thing is a little sideline to some work I've done. And I can't show it to you as I can. I had it propping up my script. But if you really want to know about maps, you can buy this book called Cartography, the Idea and its History, a very academic, weighty tome, I must admit. I'm just going to throw it out there. But one of the things that happens in ballooning is that the balloonists, when they very, very early start off in the late 18th century in Paris, they don't quite, it's still limited and restricted. In the early 20th century, balloons start to go longer distances. They're carrying their fire so they can heat the air and they can go longer distances. And the early balloonists are nothing but critical of the fact that when you look down, especially when you get above the cloud layer, all you can see are clouds. You can't really see the land. It's not visible enough. There's too many clouds obscuring everything. But by the 1840s, 1850s, ballooning, the ground mapping of landscape has become so common in Europe, at least, that when balloonists start going up, they start looking down and saying, oh, and the land was laid out just like a map. And because they've been trained by maps made from the ground, to look at landscape from above in a certain way. When they go up, that's what they see when they look down from their balloons, and they just ignore the fact they're clouds half the time. They just look at the landscape and it's like a map. It's a fascinating transition. Oh, yes, the author, me.
So Matthew Edney is the author of
The
that.
ideal in this history. Basically, the whole point of this book is that we talk about cartography, but no one's ever actually defined it, because there's an idealization based in large part upon those territorial maps from the early 19th century. So it's really a question of how the map was made, how cartography developed as an ideal, and so on. Yeah, I could pull out a copy of the History of Cartography series, but it's back behind a whole stack of books right now. I think we're forever to get at that. Sorry. Yeah.
So anyone else there have any questions about early Maine maps they would love to have answered? Now's your chance. Well, we have some thank yous and some words of appreciation mixed in with those questions as well. So I want to thank you again for coming back and repeating your presentation. We were able to reach a few more people this time, and we'll have a recording which we can share. Is that Simon Winchester?
No, Simon Winchester wrote
no. The Professor and the Madman, I'm thinking.
Yeah, and Krakatoa and
Michael Blanding.
Michael Blanding, that's right, yeah. There are a couple of books. He did one, and then there's another one. What's the same? I mean, I'm getting confused. One of these books is about Forbes Smiley, who was caught at Yale taking maps out of books. Forbes was always, it was amazing. You said, well, I would like this map and this map, and 6 months later he comes back saying, these maps are really rare. They haven't been on the market for decades, but here they are, because he's just stolen them from somewhere else. Very problematic.
Let's see. Oh, yeah.
Local land deeds with larger maps. I don't do that kind of work myself. And in fact, it's the question says, have you been able to compare local land deeds with larger maps to verify accuracy or enhance them? I do comparisons occasionally to figure out where maps are, roughly what part of the world these maps are showing, but not to assess accuracy in those ways. That's not quite what I do. And by larger maps, if you mean a map of, let's say, all of Maine or all of county, it really doesn't make much sense to compare property maps against more regional maps. It's best to compare property maps against property maps, sea charts against sea charts, regional maps against regional maps, because in practice they're all really quite different. Why they were made, how they were made, the people they were made for. And so comparing different kinds of maps gets problematic, because some sets of maps weren't made to be very precise, and try to treat them as if they were meant to be precise is not necessarily historically valid. How old are the newest maps charts in the collection? Well, some of our collection goes all the way up to the present. We have our oldest map is from 1475. It's one of the very first printed maps out of Europe of the Holy Land, and it's glorious in its own right. We have a lot of 16th, 17th, 18th century maps, but the majority of our maps is actually 19th and 20th century. We have a very large collection of modern road maps. And this is one of those areas where private collectors are great. when you have a niche area, road maps are one, or maps of language. There's a whole academic practice of mapping out distributions of language. They have all sorts of linguistic atlases. People will collect one or collect the other. And because they're dedicated to a particular niche kind of work, they really become expert, and they're able to develop and create really extensive and useful collections that are far deeper and richer than anything a professional map librarian has the time to collect. For the simple reason that the map librarian has to be pretty much a generalist. And yeah, we'll get a few road maps, let's say, and guidebooks and so on. But we don't have the time to go really searching for them because we've got to do all the other things, like cataloging and getting other kinds of maps. So when a collector is able to really create a really good collection, deep collection of material, and then give that to a library entire, is a real boon to librarians and to the researchers and scholars and students and everybody else. So we have at least 4 big collections of road maps. There are so many road maps that there's actually quite little overlap between the 4 collections, plus whatever Dr. Osher acquired and other people have given us. So it's really quite a fun collection. And you know, I just did a holiday to California, and I picked up a few maps, and they're going into the collection. And these are all maps made in the last 2-3 years. So we go all the way across. Yes. Yeah, we're going back to the map thief, and it's Smiley. Yeah, there's a Maine connection. He had a house up in Maine. Can't remember where now. He would come up and down to it, and he would stop off at the Osher Map Library and deal with us, which is always intriguing, shall we say. Yeah, and there's the information. Yeah. There's lots of copies of it around. It is a very frustrating book as an academic to read, because he uses terms in a very colloquial way that are very specialized in academic usage. He talks about how Harvard has a manuscript by John Smith, and it's not a manuscript at all, it's a printed book. But it's we use manuscript in a way that refers to anything old and early at some level. So on one level, from a persnickety academic level, yeah, but from a popular educational level, go for it. It's a good book. Cool.
All right, so last call for questions.
Oh,
So
here's a good one.
Yeah. I can read this one. Susan says, I'm a descendant of William King, first governor of Maine. And I took some cartography studio classes years ago. I just love maps. I'm so thrilled to be able to listen to this session. Last month, I went to the King Cemetery and also to Dunstan Landing in Scarborough to visit the markers of my ancestors, the King family. Special thank you to historian Don Taylor at Scarborough Historical Society for his general info and guidance to find the sites. I can't wait to see what deeds and maps are in the museum at Scarborough Historical Society once it opens. So I hope
there's some interesting maps in the Historical Society. A lot of them are, there's a 19th century practice of taking diazo prints to reproduce early maps, and so there are a couple of those that go the originals go way back. Deeds mostly you're going to be looking in the county records office, at least in this part of the world, but as far as I know. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Well, I hope Susan was able to see the Governor King, William King bed when it was here at the library with the quilt on it.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you to everyone for their questions, and thank you again to Dr. Matthew Edney for sharing his wonderful curated collection from the Osher Map Library. And I hope that everyone gets the opportunity to go online and check out that exhibit for themselves.
It's fun. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks again.